the night of June 18, 1944. The waters off Elba, Italy, 3 miles from shore. Motor machinist's mate second class Joseph Surlot stood at his battle station aboard PT 305, hands gripping the throttle controls of 3 Packard engines that together produced 4,500 horsepower. Around him, the Mediterranean stretched black and featureless, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made every wave slap against the wooden hull sound like approaching danger. Through the thin plywood walls, he could hear Lieutenant Commander Richard Dressling's voice crackling over the radio, coordinating the attack with 5 other PT boats from Squadron 22. They were hunting German F-lighters, the heavily armoured barges the Kriegsmarine used to ferry supplies along the Italian coast. Intelligence reported at least 3 of them moving south from Livorno, trying to reach German forces fighting the Allied advance. The Packard engines rumbled at idle, a sound Surlot had learned to read like a heartbeat. Any hesitation, any irregularity, could mean death. PT boats had no armour. The hull was 3/4-inch plywood over wooden frames. A single 88mm shell from an F-lighter could tear the boat in half. Speed was their only defence. Speed, darkness, and the element of surprise. Then the lookout shouted contact. Dead ahead, 2,000 yards. The silhouette of an F-lighter materialized from the darkness, 163 feet of armoured barge bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The German vessel was designed specifically to kill small boats like PT 305. Its crew had been told these American plywood mosquitoes were toys, nuisances that could be swatted from the water with concentrated fire. They were about to learn otherwise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened in those waters off Elba, you have to go back 3 years earlier, to a bureaucratic decision that would shape the entire war. Washington, D.C., summer of 1941. The United States Navy faced a critical choice about small boat warfare. While European powers had been developing motor torpedo boats since World War I, America had essentially ignored the concept. The Navy's focus remained fixed on battleships and cruisers, the traditional instruments of naval power. But reports from the early war years forced a reconsideration. British motor torpedo boats were harassing German shipping in the English Channel. Italian MAS boats were attacking British convoys in the Mediterranean. The Japanese had their own torpedo boat forces prowling the Pacific. Small, fast boats armed with torpedoes were proving surprisingly effective in coastal waters where big ships couldn't operate. The Navy established a design competition. Multiple boat builders submitted prototypes, each with different approaches to the fundamental problem of mounting torpedoes on a fast, maneuverable hull. The Electric Launch Company of Bayonne, New Jersey, purchased a British Scott Payne design and adapted it for American needs. They created an 80-foot boat powered by 3 Packard engines, capable of 41 knots at full throttle, armed with 4 Mark 8 torpedoes and an assortment of machine guns. Higgins Industries of New Orleans took a different approach. Andrew Jackson Higgins, already famous for his landing craft designs, built a 78-foot boat with a distinctive round-bottomed hull. It was slightly slower than the Elco design but more maneuverable in tight spaces. Both designs won contracts. Both would see extensive combat, but the boats themselves were just plywood and engines. What made them potentially war-winning weapons was the torpedoes they carried. The Mark 8 torpedo weighed 2,600 pounds and contained a 466-pound TNT warhead. It could travel 6,000 yards at 36 knots, or 16,000 yards at 27 knots. In theory, a single Mark 8 could sink any ship in the world if it struck in the right place. In practice, the Mark 8 was a temperamental weapon that worked when it felt like it. The depth-keeping mechanism frequently failed. The contact detonators sometimes refused to explode on impact. Torpedoes ran deep, ran shallow, ran in circles, or simply sank immediately after launch. PT boat crews learned to treat their torpedoes with a mixture of hope and suspicion, never quite certain whether the weapon would perform as designed or turn into an expensive dud. Still, even an unreliable torpedo was better than none. The mere threat of torpedo attack forced enemy ships to maneuver, to take defensive action, to waste time and fuel avoiding danger that might never materialize. And occasionally, very occasionally, the torpedoes worked exactly as designed, and then the results were spectacular. The first PT boat squadron deployed overseas left for Panama in the spring of 1942. The boats were supposed to defend the canal zone against possible Japanese attack. Instead, they spent months patrolling uneventful waters, their crews growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of action. The boats had been designed for combat, but combat remained elusive. That changed dramatically in the Philippines. Lieutenant John Bulkley's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 found itself thrust into combat almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. Operating from Manila Bay, the squadron's 12 boats faced overwhelming Japanese naval and air superiority. They conducted night patrols, attacked Japanese landing forces, evacuated wounded soldiers, and generally made nuisances of themselves against an enemy that controlled the sea and sky. On February 20th, 1942, PT-34 attacked a Japanese cruiser in Subic Bay. The torpedo missed, but the audacity of the attack shocked Japanese commanders who hadn't expected American small boats to be so aggressive. Over the following weeks, Squadron 3 claimed hits on transports, destroyers, and cruisers, though post-war analysis suggests many of these claims were optimistic. What mattered was the psychological impact. American forces, being pushed back across the Pacific, had boats that would fight. The squadron's most famous mission came in March. General Douglas MacArthur needed to evacuate from Corregidor Island before Japanese forces captured him. PT boats were the only vessels that could make the run through Japanese-controlled waters. Lieutenant Bulkley personally commanded PT-41, carrying MacArthur, his family, and key staff officers on a harrowing 600-mile journey to Mindanao. They made it through, though 2 of the 4 boats broke down en route. The mission made headlines worldwide and turned PT boats into symbols of American fighting spirit. But symbols don't win wars, results do. And the results from early PT boat operations were mixed at best. In the Solomon Islands campaign beginning in August 1942, PT squadrons faced Japanese destroyers, running supplies to isolated garrisons in what became known as the Tokyo Express. The destroyers were fast, heavily armed, and commanded by veteran crews. The PT boats were lightly armed, under-armoured, and crewed by young officers with minimal combat experience. Night after night, PT boats attacked the Tokyo Express runs. They fired torpedoes at ranges between 500 and 2,000 yards. Most torpedoes missed, many malfunctioned. The few that hit often failed to explode. Japanese destroyers began treating PT boat attacks as minor annoyances rather than serious threats. They learned that plywood boats couldn't take much punishment, that concentrated fire from multiple ships could quickly overwhelm the small craft. On August 1st, 1943, PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, was rammed and cut in half by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri during a night patrol near the Solomon Islands. The destroyer's crew apparently never saw the PT boat, or if they did, considered it too insignificant to be a threat. 2 of Kennedy's crew died in the collision. The survivors spent 6 days on a small island before being rescued. The incident highlighted a fundamental problem with PT boat doctrine. These boats were designed to attack capital ships with torpedoes, but in practice they rarely sank anything larger than a barge. By late 1943, Navy analysts were questioning the entire PT boat program. Hundreds of boats had been built at considerable expense. Thousands of skilled mechanics and technicians were assigned to PT squadrons. Training facilities at Melville, Rhode Island were churning out new crews. And yet the confirmed sinkings remained disappointingly low. PT boats had proven effective at reconnaissance, at rescuing downed pilots, at providing gunfire support during amphibious landings, But their primary mission, sinking enemy warships with torpedoes, remained largely unfulfilled. Then came the Mediterranean. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 15 arrived in North Africa in April 1943 with 18 boats and a new mission profile. Instead of attacking major warships, they would focus on German and Italian supply lines along the coast. The Mediterranean's geography made it ideal for small boat operations. Narrow straits, countless islands, and hundreds of miles of coastline that needed to be defended created perfect conditions for fast, aggressive raids. Lieutenant Commander Stanley Barnes took PT 206 into Cape Bon, Tunisia, on April 28, sneaking through German patrol zones to torpedo a tanker. The Mark 8 actually worked this time. The tanker exploded and sank, validating the entire Mediterranean deployment. Over the following months, Squadron 15 developed tactics specifically designed for coastal warfare. They learned to work with British motor torpedo boats, sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks. They discovered that German convoys moved supplies in barges and lighters rather than large merchant ships, making them perfect targets for PT boats. The squadron participated in the invasion of Sicily in July, providing reconnaissance and attacking German evacuation efforts across the Strait of Messina. They were present at Salerno in September, laying smoke screens to protect landing craft from German shore batteries. At Anzio in January 1944, PT boats patrolled offshore, interdicting German attempts to reinforce defenders by sea. Each operation refined their tactics, improved their effectiveness, made them more dangerous. But the real transformation came from the enemy they faced. German F-lighters, formerly designated Marinefährprahm, were not destroyers or cruisers. They were armoured barges, about 160 feet long, displacing 300 tons fully loaded. They were designed to carry supplies and troops in coastal waters where submarines couldn't operate effectively. And they were armed with the kind of anti-aircraft firepower that could shred a PT boat to splinters. A typical F-lighter mounted one 88mm gun, the same weapon used in the famous German anti-aircraft and anti-tank role. It also carried two 40mm guns and multiple 20mm cannon. All of these weapons could be brought to bear on surface targets. The barge's shallow draft meant torpedoes often ran underneath without hitting. Its armoured sides could withstand 50-caliber machine gun fire. And its crew of 30 to 40 men were Kriegsmarine veterans who knew how to fight. The Kriegsmarine considered F-lighters essential to their Mediterranean operations. With Allied air power dominating the skies and Allied submarines prowling offshore, the Germans couldn't move supplies by conventional merchant ships. F-lighters, hugging the coast and operating at night, became the lifeline for German forces fighting in Italy. Lose the F-lighters, and entire divisions would run out of ammunition, fuel, and food. German intelligence reports from late 1943 described PT boats dismissively. The American plywood boats were faster than F-lighters but couldn't hurt them. Their torpedoes were ineffective against shallow-draft vessels. Their guns couldn't penetrate armour. PT boats were nuisances that could be driven off with concentrated fire, not serious threats to German naval operations. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. Early engagements between PT boats and F-lighters often ended with the PT boats withdrawing under heavy fire, their crews shaken by the volume of steel flying their direction. 88mm shells created massive waterspouts when they missed, and when they hit, they went through plywood like it wasn't there. PT boats began treating F-lighter encounters as extremely dangerous missions requiring careful planning and aggressive execution. The breakthrough came from adapting tactics. PT boats stopped trying to torpedo F-lighters, recognizing that torpedoes were wasted on shallow-draft barges. Instead, they used their speed to close rapidly, their heavy machine guns to suppress the German weapons crews, and their 40mm Bofors guns to punch holes in the barge's superstructure. At ranges under 1,000 yards, even plywood boats could hurt armoured barges if they concentrated their fire. Squadron commanders also learned to attack in groups. A single PT boat against an F-lighter was asking for trouble. 3 or 4 PT boats, approaching from different directions, firing simultaneously, created a crossfire that overwhelmed German gunners. The F-lighter couldn't concentrate on one target when threats came from multiple bearings. This was classic destroyer tactics applied to small boat warfare, and it worked. By early 1944, PT boats in the Mediterranean had developed a fearsome reputation among German coastal forces. They appeared without warning from the darkness. They attacked aggressively despite being outgunned. They sank barges, shot up convoys, and forced German coastal shipping to travel only in heavily escorted groups. The boats that Kriegsmarine intelligence had dismissed as toys were strangling German supply lines. Motor torpedo boat squadrons 22 and 29 arrived in the spring of 1944, bringing the total Mediterranean PT force to over 50 boats. Squadron 22, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Richard Dressling, was equipped with the latest Higgins boats fresh from New Orleans. PT 305 was among them, commissioned on December 8, 1943, and immediately shipped to the Mediterranean theatre. The crew of PT 305 was typical of PT boat personnel, young enlisted men, most barely out of their teens, who had volunteered for hazardous duty. Motor machinists who could coax maximum performance from temperamental engines. Gunners who learned to fire accurately from a pitching deck at targets barely visible in darkness. Torpedomen who maintained weapons they half expected to malfunction at critical moments. And officers, usually lieutenants in their 20s, who carried responsibility for keeping their crews alive while accomplishing impossible missions. Their boat was 78 feet of plywood, mahogany, and oak, with aluminum superstructure to save weight. She displaced 56 tons fully loaded and drew 5 feet 3 inches of water. Her 3 Packard V12 engines produced 4,500 horsepower total, driving her to speeds exceeding 40 knots in calm seas. At maximum speed, she consumed 100 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline per hour, giving her an operational range of about 500 miles before refueling. The armament evolved throughout the war. PT 305 initially carried 4 Mark 13 torpedoes in roll-off racks amidships. She mounted one 40mm Bofors gun forward, twin 50 caliber machine guns in a turret aft, and additional 50 calibers on flexible mounts port and starboard. Later modifications added a 37mm gun, more 50s, and racks for launching rockets. By mid-1944, she bristled with so much weaponry that weight distribution became a concern. The crew lived, worked, and fought in incredibly cramped conditions. The forward cabin housed the commanding officer and executive officer. Enlisted crew slept wherever they could find space, often on deck in Mediterranean summer. Food came from a tiny galley that could barely heat canned rations. Fresh water was rationed. Toilets were buckets hung over the side. Privacy did not exist. Showers happened when you jumped into the Mediterranean between patrols, hoping no one would spot you. Combat operations ran almost entirely at night. PT boats were too vulnerable to air attack to operate in daylight. They sortied at dusk, ran dark patrols along the enemy coast, and returned before dawn. Night after night, week after week, month after month. The psychological strain was enormous. Men developed 1,000-yard stares. Minor irritations between crew members exploded into fistfights. Mail from home became precious beyond description. Connection to a world that didn't involve killing or being killed. And yet they kept going out. Because the mission mattered. Because their squadron mates depended on them. Because quitting wasn't an option. PT boat crews developed a fierce pride in their vessels and their accomplishments. They painted shark teeth on their bows. They gave their boats irreverent nicknames. PT 305 became known as the Sudden Jerk after an unfortunate docking incident, and the crew wore the name proudly. These were their ships, their brothers, their war. By June 1944, Squadron 22 had been operating along the Italian coast for months. They had participated in the landings at Anzio, where German counterattacks nearly threw Allied forces back into the sea. They had patrolled the waters off Rome as the city fell to American troops, and now they were preparing for the invasion of Elba, a strategic island that controlled approaches to the northern Italian coast. The invasion plan called for Allied forces to land on Elba's northern shore on June 18th. PT boats would provide advance reconnaissance, attack any German vessels attempting to evacuate or reinforce the garrison, and support the actual landings with gunfire. Intelligence reported that German forces on Elba included several F-lighters that would certainly try to escape once the invasion began. Squadron 22's commanding officer gathered his boat captains for final briefing. The mission was straightforward on paper. Patrol offshore, intercept any German vessels, sink or capture them before they could reach the mainland. Simple. Except F-lighters were never simple. They were tough, well-armed, and crewed by men who knew they were fighting for survival. Lieutenant William Schoonover, commanding PT 305, understood what he was asking his crew to do. They would be going hunting for some of the most dangerous targets in the Mediterranean, armoured barges specifically designed to kill small boats. Their plywood hull offered no protection. Their speed was their only advantage, and they would be operating in darkness, where identifying friend from foe could be nearly impossible until someone opened fire. The crew made their preparations. Rewrote checked the engines for the 10th time, making minor adjustments to ensure maximum reliability. The gunners test-fired their weapons, clearing jams and verifying sight alignment. The torpedomen checked their Mark 13s, even though everyone knew torpedoes were unlikely to hit shallow-draft barges. The radar operator calibrated his equipment, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for its time, able to detect surface targets at ranges exceeding 5 miles in good conditions. At 1800 hours, June 18, 1944, PT 305, and 5 sister boats slipped away from their base at Bastia, Corsica. The sun hung low over the Mediterranean, painting the water gold and crimson. Within 2 hours, that beauty would be replaced by absolute darkness, the kind of night that made depth perception impossible and turned every shadow into a potential enemy. The squadron formed up in a loose diamond pattern, maintaining intervals of roughly 200 yards between boats. Radio silence was mandatory until contact with the enemy. Hand signals and recognition lights would coordinate maneuvers. Each boat commander knew his role. Schoonover would lead the attack if they found F-lighters. The others would follow his lead, adapting to whatever situation developed. The run north took 3 hours at cruising speed, the Packard engines settling into their characteristic rumble. Rewrote monitored fuel consumption, temperature gauges, oil pressure. Everything is normal. The sea was calm, with a light chop that barely registered on PT 305's hull. Perfect conditions for high-speed attack, also perfect conditions for the enemy to spot them coming. At 2100 hours, darkness complete, the squadron reached their patrol area 3 miles off Elba's southern coast. The island was a black mass against a slightly less black sky. Ashore, they could see occasional flashes of artillery fire from the invasion preparations. The assault troops would be loading into landing craft now, preparing for the midnight run to shore. Squadron 22's job was to ensure no German vessels interfered with that landing. The radar operator hunched over his scope, watching for contacts. The early radar sets were finicky devices that required constant adjustment. Returns appeared as luminous blips on a circular screen, but distinguished between ships, land masses, and atmospheric interference required skill and experience. A good radar operator was worth his weight in gold. A bad one could lead you straight into disaster. 21:45. The radar picked up multiple contacts moving south along the coast, range 8,000 yards. The operator counted carefully. 3 distinct returns, travelling in line-ahead formation. Speed approximately 8 knots, course steady. The size and speed profile matched F-lighters perfectly. Dressling's voice crackled over the radio, breaking radio silence. All boats, this is lead. Target bearing 350, range 8,000. 3 contacts. Probable F-lighters. Prepare to attack. Schoonover acknowledged and turned to his crew. Battle stations. This is it. Men who had been lounging on deck scrambled to their positions. Gunners checked their ammunition feeds one final time. The 40mm Bofors crew loaded around and traversed the gun forward. Surlot's hands moved to the throttle controls, ready to push the Packards to maximum power on command. The squadron began its approach, accelerating to 25 knots, fast enough to close quickly, slow enough to maintain some element of stealth. The goal was to get within 2,000 yards before the Germans detected them, then make a high-speed run to firing position. 7,500 yards, 7,000. The F-lighters continued south, apparently unaware of the approaching PT boats. Perhaps their lookouts were focused on the invasion activity ashore. Perhaps they were simply exhausted after months of dangerous coastal runs. Whatever the reason, they hadn't spotted the threat. At 6,000 yards, Dressling gave the order. All boats, attack speed, execute. Surlo slammed the throttles forward. The Packard engines roared, their combined horsepower driving PT 305 up onto plane. The bow lifted, the stern squatted down, and suddenly they were skimming across the water at 40 knots, throwing spray that glowed phosphorescent in the darkness. The other 5 boats accelerated simultaneously, fanning out to attack from multiple directions. This was the tactic that had proven effective against F-lighters. Don't give them a single target. Force them to divide their fire. Overwhelm their defensive capabilities through speed and aggression. The Germans spotted them at 4,000 yards. Searchlights stabbed across the water, brilliant white beams seeking targets. One light found PT 309 off to port. Immediately, tracer fire arced across the darkness, the distinctive slow-moving red tracers of 20mm cannon, mixed with the faster white tracers of machine guns. PT 309 jinked hard to starboard, breaking the searchlight lock. Her gunners returned fire, 50 caliber tracers reaching back toward the German barge. The range was still too great for accuracy, but returning fire was psychological as much as practical. It told the Germans that these boats intended to fight. 3,000 yards. The lead F-lighter turned to present its starboard side, bringing more guns to bear. The 88mm opened fire, the muzzle flash a brilliant orange flower in the darkness. The shell passed over PT 305, with a sound like tearing canvas, and detonated in the water 500 yards beyond, throwing up a geyser of white foam. Schoonover stood in the cockpit, evaluating the tactical situation with the cold calculation required of PT boat commanders. 3 F-lighters in line-ahead formation. The lead barge had turned to engage. The other 2 were still holding course, probably preparing to scatter. If the PT boats could separate them, prevent them from supporting each other, the engagement would be much easier. Target the lead barge, Schoonover ordered. All guns, commence firing at 2,000 yards. 2,500 yards. 2,200. More searchlights swept the water. More guns opened fire. The night erupted into a chaos of light and sound. Tracers crisscrossed the darkness like lethal fireflies. Shell splashes surrounded the PT boats as German gunners found their range. PT 311 took a hit. An 88mm shell struck her port side just aft of the cockpit, punching clean through the plywood hull and exiting the starboard side without detonating. A contact fuse failure saved the boat from instant destruction, but the damage was severe. The executive officer died instantly, torn apart by shrapnel. 2 enlisted men went down wounded. The boat veered out of formation, her commander fighting to maintain control with half his crew casualties. 2,000 yards. The Bofors gunner on PT 305 opened fire, the 40mm rounds hammering out at 120 rounds per minute. Each 4th round was a tracer, showing the gunner where his fire was going. He walked his tracers onto the lead F-lighter's superstructure, the explosive rounds detonating against armor, with visible flashes. The 50 caliber turret joined in, adding twin streams of heavy machine gun fire. At this range, 50s couldn't penetrate the barge's hull armor, but they could kill exposed crew members, destroy equipment, and generally make life miserable for the Germans. The other PT boats converged from different bearings, all firing simultaneously. 4 boats, 16 heavy machine guns, 4 Bofors cannon, all concentrating on a single F-lighter. The volume of fire was staggering. The German barge disappeared behind a curtain of tracers and explosive rounds, but the F-lighter fought back. Its 88mm continued firing, the gun crew working with mechanical precision despite the incoming fire. A shell struck the water 20 yards off PT 305's starboard bow, close enough that the detonation threw spray across the deck. Schoonover ordered a hard turn to port, presenting the stern to the enemy and complicating the German gunners' targeting solution. 1,500 yards. PT 305's torpedo man stood ready at the Mark 13 launchers, waiting for the order to fire. But Schoonover held off. Torpedoes were nearly useless against F-lighters. Their shallow draft meant torpedoes usually ran underneath without hitting, and even if a torpedo did hit, its magnetic influence detonator might fail against a non-magnetic wooden or concrete hull. Better to save the torpedoes for a worthwhile target. The lead F-lighter was taking serious damage. PT boat fire had killed or wounded many of the exposed gun crews. The 88mm fell silent, its crew either dead or unable to maintain fire under the incoming barrage. The barge began to lose speed, smoke pouring from somewhere amidships. The second F-lighter opened fire, trying to support the lead vessel, but it was too far back, at least 3,000 yards, beyond effective range for most of its weapons. Only the 88mm could reach that far, and hitting a fast-moving target at night was nearly impossible even for veteran gunners. Dressling's voice came over the radio again. Lead target is hurt, PT 309 and PT 310. Finish him off. Remaining boats, take the second lighter. The squadron split, 2 boats continuing to hammer the damaged lead barge, while 3 others, including PT 305, turned their attention to the second target. The tactical situation had shifted in the Americans' favor. 2 F-lighters were now facing 5 PT boats, and one of the barges was already crippled. Schoonover lined up PT 305 for another firing run. Sirlot coaxed every bit of speed from the Packards, the engines screaming at maximum RPM. 41 knots across calm water, the boat shuddering with vibration, every loose item in the hull rattling and bouncing, 1,200 yards from the second F-lighter. The German commander was turning, trying to present his bow to the attacking PT boats, minimizing his profile. Smart tactic. It reduced the target area and brought his forward guns to bear, but it also meant he wasn't running, wasn't trying to escape. He intended to fight it out. The 88mm flashed again. The shell passed directly over PT 305's cockpit, so close that Schoonover and his crew felt the pressure wave. If the German gunner had dropped his aim 2 feet, the shell would have detonated in the boat's engine room, and everyone aboard would have died. Return fire, all guns. Schoonover's order was barely audible over the roar of engines and weapons. The Bofors hammered out rounds, each explosive 40mm, creating a visible flash on the F-lighter's deck. The 50 calibers added their contribution, hundreds of rounds per minute converging on the German barge. At this range, even machine gun fire was deadly to exposed crew members. 1,000 yards. PT 305 and her squadron mates were now close enough to see details of the F-lighter's superstructure. The barge was exactly as intelligence had described, a squat, ugly vessel with a flat bottom and high sides, designed for carrying cargo rather than elegance. But it was also heavily armed and clearly determined to take some PT boats down with it. A 40mm round from the F-lighter struck PT 305's forward deck, detonating against the Bofors gun shield. The explosion killed the gun captain instantly and wounded the loader. The Bofors fell silent, its crew dead or incapacitated. Schoonover felt the boat shudder from the impact, but couldn't spare attention for damage assessment. They were committed to the attack now. Breaking off would just present a better target to the German gunners. Hard to starboard, close to 500 yards. The order seemed insane, closing to point-blank range with an armoured barge that could tear them apart. But it was classic PT boat tactic. Get close enough that the German guns couldn't traverse fast enough to track. Get close enough that every shot from the PT boat's weapons would hit. Get close enough that the enemy crew would panic. 500 yards, 400, 300. PT 305 roared past the F-lighters portside at maximum speed, every gun that could bear firing directly into the barge's superstructure. The range was so close that the 50 caliber gunners could see German sailors diving for cover. They could see the 88mm crew desperately trying to traverse their weapon to track the PT boat. They could see the battle damage from earlier hits, torn metal, shattered equipment, bodies sprawled on deck. And then they were past, racing back into the relative safety of darkness, the F-lighters' return fire falling astern. Schoonover looked back to assess damage. 2 men down at the Bofors position. Minor damage to the forward deck. But the boat was still making maximum speed, still fully maneuverable. They had survived the close pass. The second F-lighter was now taking fire from 3 PT boats simultaneously. The volume of incoming fire was simply overwhelming. No matter how well armoured the barge was, no matter how determined its crew, it couldn't withstand this kind of punishment indefinitely. Fires broke out amidships. The 88mm fell silent. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition cooking off. Behind them, PT 309 and PT 310 reported the lead F-lighter was sinking. The concentrated PT boat fire had punched enough holes in the barge's hull that it was taking on water faster than pumps could handle. The German crew was abandoning ship, jumping into the Mediterranean and swimming for shore 3 miles distant. That left 1 F-lighter still operational, the third barge in the original formation, which had turned north and was attempting to escape back toward Livorno at maximum speed. Dressling ordered PT 307 and PT 313 to pursue, while the damaged boats regrouped. But the third F-lighter had made a critical mistake. In turning to run, it had presented its stern to the pursuing PT boats. The stern was the least protected part of an F-lighter, with minimal armour and few weapons that could bear directly aft. PT 307 closed to within 800 yards, lined up carefully, and fired 2 Mark 13 torpedoes. The Mark 13 was an air-launched torpedo that had been adapted for PT boat use. It was smaller and lighter than the Mark 8, carrying only 600 pounds of explosive. But it was also more reliable, with better depth keeping and a more sensitive detonator. At 800 yards against a slow-moving target, even a PT boat crew could manage a reasonable hit probability. Both torpedoes ran true. The first struck the F-lighter's stern just below the waterline. The explosion was spectacular. A massive geyser of water and debris that lifted the barge's stern several feet out of the water. The second torpedo hit 10 seconds later, slightly to port of the first. The combined explosions tore the F-lighter's stern completely off. The barge settled rapidly, its stern gone, water flooding into the hull through the massive breach. Within 3 minutes it was gone, sliding beneath the Mediterranean with its crew still aboard. A few survivors made it to the surface, but in the darkness and confusion there was no way to mount a rescue operation. The PT boats couldn't stop to pick up enemy survivors while still in combat waters. 23:30 hours. The engagement had lasted just under 90 minutes. 3 German F-lighters destroyed. 1 PT boat, PT 311, severely damaged with 3 casualties. The other boats had taken minor damage, bullet holes, shrapnel scars, nothing that affected their combat capability. And most importantly, no German vessels had escaped to interfere with the Elbe invasion. The squadron regrouped and began the run back to Bastia. PT 311 limped along at reduced speed, her crew working frantically to patch the 88mm hole in her hull. The dead were laid out on deck, wrapped in canvas. The wounded received what first aid was possible, given the primitive medical supplies aboard PT boats. In PT 305's cockpit, Schoonover allowed himself a moment of exhaustion. His hands shook slightly from the adrenaline crash. His ears rang from hours of engine noise and gunfire. He could smell cordite, fuel, and the copper scent of blood from the forward gun position. This was victory, but it didn't feel glorious. It felt like survival. Surlot kept the engines running smoothly, monitoring gauges by the dim red glow of the instrument lights. One of the Packards was running slightly hot, probably from sustained maximum power operation. He made a mental note to check the cooling system once they were back at base. The engines had performed flawlessly during combat. They deserved careful maintenance. The gunners were already cleaning their weapons, removing the carbon buildup from hours of firing. The 50 caliber machine guns in particular required constant maintenance. Let them get dirty, and they would jam at the worst possible moment. Every PT boat crew had stories of guns failing during combat, usually at the exact moment when working weapons meant the difference between life and death. Dawn was breaking as PT 305 entered Bastia Harbour. The base was already bustling with activity. Intelligence officers waited to debrief the crews. Mechanics stood ready to begin repairs. Medical personnel were prepared to treat the wounded, and boat captains from other squadrons gathered to hear the details of the engagement. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Every detail of the engagement was recorded: courses, speeds, ranges, gun hits observed, enemy damage assessed. Navy intelligence needed this information to refine tactics, to improve training, to help other PT boat crews survive similar engagements. Schoonover's after-action report would be distributed throughout the Mediterranean PT boat force within days. The kills were officially credited. 3 F-lighters sunk. The squadron's score for the war now included 7 barges, 2 E-boats, and a destroyer escort. Not bad for boats the Kriegsmarine had dismissed as toys. Not bad at all. But there was little time for celebration. PT 305 needed repairs. The forward Bofors position had to be completely rebuilt. The deck structure where the 40mm round hit needed replacement. Minor damage throughout the boat required attention. The mechanics estimated 3 days before PT 305 would be combat ready again. The crew used those 3 days to rest, write letters home, and try to process what they had experienced. Combat had a way of compressing time. 90 minutes of fighting felt like hours when you lived through it, but in memory, it telescoped down to a series of vivid snapshots, muzzle flashes in darkness, tracers arcing across water, the shock of incoming fire, the satisfaction of seeing your rounds hit home. Young men aged quickly in PT boats. The average age of an enlisted PT boat crew member was 19. After 6 months of combat, operations, they looked and acted like men 10 years older. They had seen friends die. They had killed enemy sailors. They had lived through situations where death came within feet of claiming them. They had earned the right to be tired. By June 21st, PT 305 was back in service. The Bofors position had been rebuilt, stronger than before. Fresh ammunition was loaded. Fuel tanks were topped off. The Packard engines purred like predatory cats, ready for another night patrol. And the crew, despite exhaustion, was ready to go back out. Because the job wasn't finished. German forces were still fighting in Italy. Supply barges were still trying to reach isolated garrisons. And Squadron 22 still had a mission to complete. The Navy hadn't sent them to the Mediterranean for rest and recreation. They were here to sink ships, and that's exactly what they would continue doing until someone told them to stop. The next patrol was scheduled for June 22nd. Reported more F-lighters operating out of Piombino, trying to evacuate German supplies from depots threatened by Allied advances. Squadron 22 would be hunting again, prowling the darkness for targets. Surlot checked his engines one final time. Schoonover studied the charts, plotting potential intercept courses. The gunners test-fired their weapons over open water, verifying that the repairs hadn't affected alignment or function. The torpedomen checked their Mark 13s, though everyone knew the next engagement would probably be fought with guns rather than torpedoes. 1800 hours, June 22nd. 6 PT boats slipped away from Bastia, heading north into gathering darkness. Somewhere ahead, German barges were moving supplies, trying to keep their forces fighting, and 6 plywood boats, dismissed as toys by an enemy that no longer believed its own propaganda, were going hunting again. The pattern would repeat through the summer of 1944. Night, patrols, brief violent engagements, return to base before dawn. PT 305 and her squadron mates sank barges, shot up convoys, and generally made German coastal operations a nightmare. They took casualties, they lost boats, but they accomplished their mission. By August, when Allied forces broke out of the Italian beachheads and began the drive north, German coastal shipping in the western Mediterranean had been effectively shut down. The F-lighters still operated, but in smaller numbers and with much greater caution. The Kriegsmarine had learned, painfully and at considerable cost, that American PT boats were not toys. They were hunters, and the Mediterranean had become their hunting ground. PT 305 survived the war, and is now the only fully restored and operational Higgins PT boat in the world, maintained by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. She operates on Lake Pontchartrain, giving visitors the chance to ride aboard a genuine piece of naval history. The boat participated in numerous engagements beyond the action described here, serving throughout the Mediterranean campaign until war's end. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 22 completed over 200 combat patrols and was credited with sinking or damaging dozens of enemy vessels. 3 squadron members received Navy Crosses for extraordinary heroism. Casualty rates among PT boat crews in the Mediterranean were approximately 15%. 1 in 7 men who served in PT boats became a casualty. The dismissive attitude toward PT boats documented in German intelligence reports was genuine. Early in the war, Kriegsmarine officers did refer to PT boats as toys or plywood mosquitoes. By mid-1944, that assessment had changed dramatically. German after-action reports from the Italian campaign repeatedly warned about the effectiveness of American PT boat attacks and the difficulty of defending slow coastal vessels against fast, aggressive, small boat tactics. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.